Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. Joining me today is the editor of classic comics like 100 Bullets, Why the Last Man, and Scalped, as well as current books like Descender, Gideon Falls, and the upcoming anthology Where We Live. It's Will Dennis. Thanks for coming on, Will.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on, David.
So, you're here largely to talk about Where We Live, the anthology project you're working on with J.H. Williams III, and a massive list of other people. But
Right.
I want to start with one of the things that doesn't get talked a lot about in comics is what exactly an editor does, and that's your role. Most of the time, I feel like editors get brought up is when you guys are ruining, this or that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm kind of curious. Like these days, you're a freelance editor. Before you worked for Vertigo. What exactly does your role these days entail, and how much does that vary from project to project?
Even besides ruining things, what you're saying?
Besides running, I imagine that's the 60 or 70% of
Well,
your job.
that's the most rewarding part of the job, frankly. But yeah, I mean, it's akin to like a movie producer, I guess, without, the movie producer money attached to it. But it's like, your writers are coming to you with projects, pitching you ideas. Certainly at Vertigo, like the writer was the generator of almost all the projects, so it would just, they'd come to you with that. And then once we're sort of, sometimes they're a team, sometimes, there's already an artist attached to it, sometimes there isn't. And, then we develop the idea and then we just sort of build the team. And then you're responsible for, kind of everything. Even, I mean, at DC, we had a obviously pretty robust staff of support,
Mm-hmm.
up and down the line, production, publicity, marketing, et cetera. When you're on your own, obviously you don't have nearly as much of that, but I mean you're doing a lot more of that yourself. But yeah, so you're in charge of keeping everything running. You're reading the scripts. You're sort of offering ideas, but then you're also proofreading everything and checking everything for just the real basic stuff like that. And but it's mostly kind of big picture, overseeing things and managing people's personalities and getting work out of them when they don't want to do work and that sort of stuff. I mean, it's a huge psychological the psychological aspect of it or interpersonal aspect is probably one of the biggest parts of the job.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a part of the job for me personally. I always felt like was the best part of the job for me. Like I know a lot of other editors that I would say are much better, story editors or art editors or color editors, or they could look at something and say, oh, fix this 5% and here's what you need to do like that. I don't know that sort of nuts and bolts stuff was always necessarily my best thing, but I think I was good at, or I'm good at, finding the right people, putting them together, helping them work, everybody row in the right direction and, keep people's spirits up and be, a hard ass when you need to be and nice when you don't and, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I think that was always my sort of strongest point was being able to do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like, well, I feel like a lot of freelance editors work with the same people over and over. I feel like you kind of have a core group of quote unquote, what I'll call repeat customers. Like you work with Brian
Yeah.
Azzarello a lot. You're
Yeah.
working with Jeff Lemire on multiple books, both of whom have a background at Vertigo. Like is when it comes down to it, it seems like people are almost more important to which projects you take than the ideas that you're collaborating on. Is that, would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, also, no, I'm as lazy as the next person. I mean, I feel like I work pretty hard, but it's not hard work, so to speak. So, for me, it was always like if I can find the really good people to do this, and they, all are in the same, mindset, and everybody's sort of respecting each other professionally. Like my job is really easy, right? I mean, my
Right.
job shouldn't be. I mean, the best days are the days when I don't need to be doing any of that, monkey business. Where there's a lot of editors, I think, that feel like if they're not putting their fingerprints all over something or asking for a change or whatever, then they're not really doing their job, which I've never subscribed to that philosophy. I mean, for me, it's like, Brian Azzarello and Eduardo Riso, like at this point in their careers, what am I really going to contribute to them? I mean, I think I have a moment here or there when I'll point something out or whatever. And also since I'm not doing that all the time, like it generally resonates more, when I do it in terms of, hey, this seems a little wonky to me, or I don't know about that, or because I'm not constantly, oh, fix this, fix that. I think it's like your parents or whatever. If they're constantly on your case, after a while, you're just sort of like, it's just background noise. It's like the parents and the peanuts or something,
Hmm.
just sort of So, I was pretty good at picking my spots and stuff, but yeah, I mean, I definitely have these people that, I've built these relationships with over the years, and particularly when I left Vertigo, like you know, it was pretty clear, like some of those people, I was going to have to lean on a little more than maybe I had in the past, or just sort of, I was lucky that they were all very loyal and, kept asking me to help on projects and things, particularly since a lot of them are at the point where I don't know what they need help necessarily. I mean, it's like they're pretty, I mean, I think they understand the value of the help I provide, but, it's not as if, like I said, a lot of these guys necessarily need it, as
Hmm.
much even newer people probably need, slightly more guidance and stuff. But yeah, I've been lucky. I mean, but it's a lot of it's just you build these relationships. I mean, I've been in the industry now like almost 20 years. So, I mean, that's, a lot of relationships that you sort of build over the years. So,
I feel like, I mean, just as an outsider, it kind of seems to me that like one of the core tenets of like a good freelance editor is like knowing for the creators, knowing that you can trust them, that they're going to lead the book in the right way, that they're going to, give creative guidance, that they're not just going to constantly, like you said, necessarily put their fingerprints on it. They want to just make sure that they make the best, or help you make the best book. Would you say, is that a fair statement?
yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, that seems to be why I think they continue to, hire me and call me up for stuff and throw ideas at me. I think because they get an honest answer from me, but I also feel like my bedside manner's always been pretty good. So, I'm not just like, oh, that sucks or fix that. And, like I said, I really have never subscribed to that notion of like if you're not asking for a change, you're not doing your job. And I mean,
Right.
I know a lot of editors that I mean literally will verbalize that like out loud. Like if they don't, if I didn't ask for something to be fixed on, every page, then I didn't do my job, which is just insane.
Yeah.
So to me, I mean, I guess it works. Everybody's got their own style, their own approach. So, it's fine if that's your thing. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely it's definitely a big part of it. I mean, it's a difficult thing. I've never really written stuff or created my own stuff. So, and a lot of it's just fear, right? Like a lot of it's just terror of showing it to somebody else or, being judged or whatever. So, I've always really felt like if these people, like I'm their first reader, like I'm probably generally, except maybe their wife or husband or whomever, like I'm the first person that's going to read it. So anytime they have to do it, send something, hit send on the email, and I get it, like that's a real, that's a big deal, right? So it's like there's a sense that like, you have to respect that in terms of what it took for that person to do it and what it took for them to send it and and why I mean that's the thing too. For me, the differentiator for most successful artists, creators is that they do the work, right? I mean,
Right.
that's the big thing. I mean, no one seems to want to deal with that or get that or really, acknowledge that fully, but it's like they did the work when 99% of the rest of us didn't, and they had the balls or the guts or whatever to send it to somebody and say, is this any good? Does it say anything that matters? Do you care? Does it suck? Is it great? So it's, you have to keep that front of mind always in terms of that. And I think, so over the years, these people, they do get respectful opinions. They get good constructive feedback, generally, they trust you, right? I mean, it's what you
Hmm.
said. I mean, that's what it boils down to. It's just like this level of sort of trust that we have with each other.
I am kind of curious though. Do you feel like obviously Eduardo Riso and Brian Azzarello are a completely different animal than like a partnership that like Jeff Lemire and Dustin Wen,
Hmm.
because like I may be mistaken, but I don't remember Jeff and Dustin working a lot together before Descender. But
Right.
but then you have like obviously Brian and Eduardo probably have like years of shorthand between 100 Bullets and Brother Lono and Spaceman and everything like that. Like do you feel like your role differentiates in a significant way depending on like the longevity of the collaboration, or is it really just person to person still?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, well, it probably is a little different. I mean, like with Brian and Eduardo, but yeah, I mean, it's sort of case by case. I mean, I do tend to attract a certain level of, and maybe it's my own personality. As I said, like I don't really want to be spending a lot of time stuck in the weeds or with a lot of drama and all that sort of stuff.
Sure.
Like I feel like just in general in life, you tend to, I mean, one of the things about being older, I feel like you tend to attract like, attracts like in a way,
Right.
so it's like those types of creators, I think, feel more comfortable with me because I am fairly laid back and fairly, chilled out about stuff. And So I mean, I haven't in my career had tons of drama, and when I've had drama with certain creators or whatever, like that's usually it, right? Like I'm not generally going back to the well,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just like I don't. But then there are other people, other editors that always seem to have, swirling around them and these sorts of characters that always, are causing more what I'd call drama or whatever. But but some people think that's the way to get better work out of them. I mean, one of my big fears or doubts about my career, even at times, is like, do I push hard enough? Like, am I too chilled out? Am I too laid back? Guys like Jeff Lemire or Azrael, like pretty quiet, like reserved guys, right? Like, I mean, I can get them to chat and talk, and we have pretty good relationships like that, but most people meeting them or seeing them at shows or on panels or whatever are like those guys are, like they're like sphinxes, right? I mean, like they don't. So it's like, you know, so I do tend to create, but then that's the thing. Like I always sort of, everybody has, or at least I have self doubt like everyone else, and there are those moments where like, did I push hard enough? Should I have pushed harder on that? Should I have, stood up to that person more or what? I mean, that makes it sound like it's more adversarial than it is, but yeah, I think you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, it's like that cuts both ways. That like if you're sort of chilled out and real kind of reserved and pick your spots. Like sometimes I think in the past, I think there's times when I've been too. It's not even caution. It's just too sort of cool.
Yeah.
And,
I feel like there's a fine line. It's like if you're so chilled out where you're like the guy that they hire so they can feel better about their bad decisions, that'd be
right.
one thing. But it's like, as long as you're like the guy who's giving them honest feedback one way or another and they know they can trust that, I feel like that's ultimately what's most meaningful.
Hmm. Hmm.
But
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
imagine that self doubt would probably hit related to that.
I hope that's what they would say. If they ask the same things. I think it is. I mean, like you say, given that most of the people I'm working with, particularly now, are people that I had either worked with in the past or been somewhat instrumental in helping them, in the past, or just built some kind of relationship with them. So yeah, I mean, nobody's forcing them to hire me. So I mean, presumably that everything's cool there. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, everybody's got their moments of sort of doubt and pain, right?
Had you? I was trying to look through your credits to see if you had worked with Jeff before at Vertigo. It didn't seem like you had. Had you?
Lemire?
Yeah.
No. No, I never had. I mean, he was sort of around. I mean, I remember meeting him, Bob Schreck, I think, like probably work with him first, and because Schreck was always bringing in all, because he was at Vertigo for, a short period of time. Well, whatever, he was in this sort of between DCU and sort of Vertigo. It was a little nebulous, but, he had always had this amazing track record of finding all of these really super talented, more kind of indie people. And
Mm-hmm.
I definitely feel like I met, Jeff at some point through like him being, Bob's office or visiting Bob or whatever. So no, I was around like when, Sweet Tooth and a bunch of those other projects were getting launched. And, I'd see him at shows and hang out a little bit. And then, he got to be pretty good friends with Scott, Snyder. And, I mean, that was the thing. Like we did build, particularly at Vertigo. I mean, and, between Doyle and I for sure. But, you know, our philosophy was like we were building like a crew, right? I mean, it was
Right.
like built like a mafia family in a certain way, where it was just sort of like once you kind of were in, like you were sort of in with like all of these people. So, if Jock is in because, him and Andy Diggle come in, but then he gets to hang out with Scott and Jeff at shows, and then suddenly they're doing this, so it was like that to me was all the big part of my job. I felt, and like the most rewarding part was to make all these sort of connections, right? With
Mm-hmm.
people and see, and even if they weren't going to work with me forever, I still get a lot of satisfaction out of seeing people that you sort of brought up or gave a shot to connect with another person that you did, or do something cool together, whether it's Scott and Jock and a Batman thing, or whatever it is, so yeah. But I never worked with Jeff, and even I mean we've only been working together since November. I mean he's had all these projects for years that he's kind of just done on his own,
Right.
but he was just starting to feel, he's got 3 or 4 at Image, which is all I'm working on with him. I don't help him on like the other stuff, like the Black Hammer stuff or other things that he's doing for other companies. But
He's a busy dude.
yeah, I mean, right? I mean, I mean, even just the projects we have at Image. I mean, there's 3 or 4 like at any one time, and then yeah, I mean, he's got the Dark Horse stuff, and I think I don't know if he's
Valiant.
back at DC and he's done all that stuff at Valiant, and
Yeah, and he's doing stuff
yeah,
at
I don't know.
DC. I feel like I need a manager just to keep up with what he's doing. So he definitely needs an editor for his books, I
Yeah,
imagine.
drawing, he's like writing and drawing. So it's not just that he's writing like 10 scripts, a month. So, he does that Royal City, he writes and draws. And then, he just did that big hardcover, for, was it, I think Simon and Schuster or somebody, not too long ago. So, I mean, it's, yeah, I don't know. He's, I've never worked with anyone that I would say is quite as prolific as he is, I mean, maybe Riso is the only other person who's just, must just every day just, get the most out of their time every day, because I don't get the sense from Jeff that he's working like some of these guys who work, vampire sort of hours
Right.
and they're all, I mean, I think he's up, he goes to his studio, he does his work and he goes home. Like he doesn't, I don't get the sense that, when I never hear from him on a Saturday and he's like freaking out because, he didn't do X, Y, and Z, right? Whereas that's not the case always with other people.
I've always got the impression he's just extremely efficient because like you have to be when you're doing as much as he is, especially because like you said, he draws his own stuff too. I mean, he had a graphic novel last year. I mean,
Right.
he's drawing. It's Royal City still happening, right? That's still going on.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
still
So
going.
and he's drawing that, and I know he does a lot of different stuff. I mean, it's pretty amazing. But I want to talk about your story preferences as a person because I feel like, especially when you're at Vertigo, and maybe that was just a Vertigo thing, but I feel like there's a kind of general vibe I can get from like a Will Dennis book. Is there
Hmm.
is there like a particular type of story you prefer, and do you feel like the books you edit or have edited are reflective of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a vibe to like the body of work that I've, done. I mean, I felt like, I was there, like, Axel Alonso and I worked there for like maybe, I don't know, not very long. It felt like a long time, but maybe it was like 9 months or so
Mm-hmm.
that he went to Marvel. This is around 2000,
Right.
and I was like the newest person there. But, he had clearly carved out like a niche in terms of, books that, had a different feel than the typical, what I'd consider like a Vertigo book, like at least a 90s Vertigo book,
Crime
Um,
started kind of entering the picture a bit more.
yeah, there was crime, and I mean, he was working on Preacher, but he was, there was crime stuff and war stuff, and just, some of that more, stuff a little bit further away from the kind of dark fantasy Sandman spin-offs or whatever. So, yeah, so I mean, it was clear that like that was an area that needed some development, that he had sort of opened up the door there fairly well. So once he left, and it's like, you're looking at, well, how am I going to advance and how am I going to differentiate myself from other people here, and so that was for me was a fairly conscious choice of like, there's a lot of this sort of stuff that because that's the kind of stuff in my real life that I would gravitate towards too, right? Like I mean, I would certainly have seen tons of movies and watch a lot of TV. I mean, I read a lot of books. I mean, I read like crazy. So, and I generally had gravitated towards like, crime fiction and some fantasy. Like I'm much more a fan of like fantasy stuff than people would think,
Mm-hmm.
just given the stuff I work on. But and in horror, kind of Lovecraftian horror, whatever it was. So like that's the kind of stuff I was always reading. Like I wasn't really reading, memoirs and sort of, kind of more, stuff that would be in the more kind of fiction, newer fiction stuff, much more like genre, stuff I'd always read. So yeah, so to me it seemed like, well, that's sort of an area that needs some, there's room for me to make some kind of a mark in those areas, So yeah, so I mean there was definitely those sorts of things. I mean, Vertigo, we didn't really the weird thing with Vertigo is like everyone would always ask, like, well, what are you looking for? And I, my response was always like, well, I know it when I see it, right? Like, we didn't have a check. I think people thought we had like a checklist or,
Like there's a
you know,
Vertigo brand.
yeah. And there was from the standpoint of like, we would have meetings once a year or so, kind of retreats where we'd go through like, okay, well, suddenly we have 5 books that are crime books, and we don't have any books that are like, horror books. So, we'd have things like that where we'd sit down and sort of say like, hey, we're a little heavy on dark fantasy, but we don't have any science fiction, So you'd maybe in the back of your mind have an idea like, oh, let's go find something like that. But I wasn't really generating projects like myself in terms of like I never would say like I have an idea for a science fiction, gangster story and go out and find somebody to do it,
Right.
Other editors would do that, which is fine. I mean, it's just sort of your own personal approach. Like I would tend to let the stuff sort of come to me in a lot of ways. But again, I don't know. It's some of it's weird coincidence or kismet. Some of it's like the energy you put out. I mean, that sounds really stupid, but like I think people like the Jason Aarons of the world or something where it's like, Jason and I have a lot of sort of similar interests, and so it's like he's looking for someone who can sort of
Help
get
him
what he's,
realize that.
yeah, and vice versa. So it's like, so yeah, so people weren't pitching me a lot of sort of Sandman type spin-off stuff, right? Over the years, like I think creators, the smart ones at least, recognize like who they might connect with or who they might have a better shot just selling something to, right? Because at some point it does come down to like a sell. So, but yeah, I mean, there was definitely those things. I mean, we never really had checklists in terms of, well, it has to have this, it has to have that. We wanted books that were smart, and if they were something that it was an idea you'd heard 100 times, but there was like a wrinkle on it, then that was something you would probably, a thread that you'd follow a little bit more. But it had to have a certain quality level, and it had to have a certain point of view to it. I mean, that was
Right.
those are the things, but those are all kind of nebulous things to say to a writer. I mean, I would say those things. I said them a million times, but even saying it out loud now sounds kind of like it's not the greatest direction necessarily to give to struggling writers always. But
And it's kind of tough because like I kind of feel like you either have it or you don't. Like with
mhm,
like I'm a not to play favorites or something, but I one of my favorite books that you worked on that Vertigo ever published that I for some reason in my head have decided that it's probably one of your favorites too was Scalped. Like I love
yeah,
that. It's absolutely one of
yeah.
my favorite books ever, and like I don't think you could challenge Jason Aaron to do that book. Like it was something that had to come from him.
Yeah, right. And it had to come at the time that it came, and we'd already done the other side, and we started
Right.
talking about doing some other stuff. But yeah, I mean, probably of all the projects I worked on, I would say that's the one. You don't want to say, oh, it's my favorite one, but I think it's the one that sort of coalesced like all the work I'd been doing up to that point, and all of the interests I had, and all of the sort of feel that I wanted from something. Because to me, it's like that book is like the feel of it. Like we used to talk about, like, you can see like Carol, like, she's like the femme fatale, but like you can see like her fingernails are dirty, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like there's something just, she's not that Moll that you've seen a million times in like a gangster movie or a gangster comic or whatever. Like, she's dangerous, she's sexy, she's smart, she's all those things, but like also like she's chewed her fingernails down to like the nub or they're dirty. Like there's just that like that level, that human level of sort of
Mm-hmm.
that deeply human, flawed, weird level. Like, I mean, there's not a character in that book that isn't at some levels like incredibly flawed, but also like, possibly redeemable. I mean, maybe
Right.
the FBI guy is like maybe the closest to like a really just gone character, but I mean, that's the thing. And yeah, I don't know. I don't. I mean, that's probably the book that if I had to choose, that sort of, like I said, I mean, kind of coalesce like all of the things that I liked out of books and movies and things that really got my blood pumping or whatever. Like that's probably the one. I mean, there's certainly other ones that I love, whatever. But like, even a book like 100 Bullets, like like as much characters and there is in that, and all the characters and like how slick it is, like it's so slick at times that like there's like that's probably the differentiator. Like it's maybe a 2% difference to me in terms of my love of one versus the other or whatever. It's like yeah, there's, whatever. You just there's everybody's got like their thing, but so that's yeah, that's definitely. And but that I mean, Scalp started out as like he was pitching a cowboy western that was like
Oh.
Scalp Hunter, like it was like some old DC character. Um, that I don't even remember. I think he was like one of the Kubert, like I can sort of picture him, but yeah, it was like a thing. And I used to have a list of characters, right, that like DC had sort of signed off on us using. Like I used to go through those who's who, like those ridiculous volumes of
Mm-hmm.
80s, like encyclopedia, not ridiculous, but like just, I mean, only from the standpoint of when you'd read these listings of, Space Cabbie and Scout Hunter,
Yeah.
like, they'd have all these stats about how tall they were and where they were born, all this kind of crazy stuff. But so I had a list of characters that they had basically said like they weren't doing anything with, and if you want to do something with it, like go ahead. So that's like how we got the losers, for instance, right? Like that was one that they just were like, do whatever you want with it. Like it's just sitting here. They wanted to keep doing them because they want to like keep the trademarks and copyrights like active.
Right.
So
Right.
like the occasion, that's why you'd see these projects that were like, why are they doing that? Like a lot of time, that's why they were doing that. But yeah. And so I mean, Scalp Hunter was on that list. There was, I know Space Cat. I always say Space Cabbie, but he was definitely on the list. The losers were on there. Like there was lots of these just throwaway characters that sometimes you would just say, but And I don't even remember that I pitched. I don't think I pitched that to Jason because I immediately was like, we already had this Western book, Loveless, which was like a, Azarel's book. Like we couldn't sell it. Like nobody was buying it. I mean, I thought it was great, but nobody was buying it. Westerns are just a hard sell in the United States, ironically. But yeah, so he pitched this thing, and it was maybe only a paragraph or two, and I was like, yeah, it's cool, but like we can give this away, like
Right.
so what can we do? We started talking about it stuff, and I'd grown up in New York State, like in central New York, kind of not far from like the Onondaga Nation, like reservation. Yeah, and we were talking about some stuff, and he had a lot of ideas like kind of peripherally related, and then it just sort of spun out of these conversations about once you live on this reservation and there's money starts to come into a situation like that, like then naturally all these other things start to happen, and it's like, what if you just sort of exaggerated all those things to a certain extent? Because I mean, like when I grew up, like the nation up there was super poor, and it really, a lot of these places really are still like just unbelievably. But then a lot of them all have these casinos on them, so then it's suddenly like there's this giant, there's nothing else like in central New York except, you drive, and then there's like this giant, like, 2001 like monolith that's just this money making machine,
Yeah.
and you've basically plopped that down in the middle of this otherwise very sort of, rich environment, but so yeah, a lot of that just sort of came out of, what happens when you start to infuse that, stuff. And yeah, and we're always talking about movies we liked and, certain things. And, I don't know, it just sort of spun out of there from there. I mean, obviously he's doing the lion's share of the creative work, so but yeah, I mean, that's sort of like the weird, twisty turn that like a project like that will take. Whereas sometimes, other times they would just be like, this is what it is, like it's fully formed. And,
Hmm.
there's not a lot of that, back and forth,
Yeah. No,
so,
it is kind of funny. I love that it went from being a western to because and you moved away from it because it was maybe too nichey and hard to sell to something that I think is probably even nichier and hard to sell, but yet it worked. So I love
yeah,
it.
but still, yeah. But with, obviously like a Western, sort of feel to it
Right.
in a lot of the sort of tropes of a Western. But yeah, and then you meet Guerra, and he's Serbian, but he lives in Barcelona, but like no one's ever heard of him, but he knows every Western movie under the sun, like cold, So, and it's just like you can talk about any esoteric, strange 70s, 60s, whatever kind of Western, or otherwise generally like culty film, So it's just like weird thing, like they just sort of align like that, Like he's the perfect person to draw that book because it's like it's everything that he's been,
He's been
absorbing.
building that for his
Life,
entire
yeah.
career or life,
He's like
basically.
Yeah, and he's this incredible like blues guitar player who's like toured all over Europe with bands for like years and years and years and opened for every like kind of famous blues guitar player ever. And yeah, like you can look up, there's videos of him online like playing like in clubs and stuff. And I mean, he's sick, and he's got this Stratocaster that looks like Eric Clapton's. Like, it's all worn out and just. But and he, but like so, like there's a guy who's like he just gets it immediately, just gets it. Like he is just like the guy for that. Like he's seen it all. He's moved out of his own country because of this insane civil war that breaks out like in the early '90s. Like he's. I don't know. Like I don't like weird things like that. Like I don't know how that happens, right? Like I mean, a million of the artists that could have like, sent stuff in or we'd gotten for that. Like, but here's a person that's just like,
The perfect blend of everything you
yeah, it's
need.
like growing him in a laboratory. Like I couldn't have
Yeah.
found the perfect person to be the artist on that book in particular.
So one thing I wanted to actually ask you about involving Vertigo and your time there is like, so during your span, there was like this interesting trend where they were like some of the greatest single artist runs on cover art ever, which included Jock on Scalped, which is, in my opinion, one of the best runs ever. I mean, obviously there was like James Jean on Fables. You worked with John Paul Leon on DMZ. Yuko Shimizu was doing the Unwritten. I mean, like that's just four, but I'm sure that there were plenty of other like brilliant options or brilliant examples. What was that like? Was that like just good timing, or was that like a core focus on Vertigo books that you guys wanted to accomplish, like having brilliant cover art that is the same throughout, more or less?
Yeah, that was pretty core kind of a tenet of the whole imprint. I think. I mean, going back to Dave McKean on Sandman, right? I mean,
Right.
that was. I mean, that was one of the. I mean, it's like again, it's like a double-edged sword because it's like, I remember like even my wife, she doesn't really read comics, but like years ago, looking at like a Sandman comic and being like, oh, this cover's so awesome, and then not being so thrilled by the art on the inside, because it's
Right.
totally different, But yeah, I mean, that was a pretty. I mean, if even on runs on books like Hellblazer with Glenn Fabry or Sean Phillips or whoever was doing these long runs on but yeah, that was definitely. I mean, Dave Johnson did what 100 covers plus all the trades of 100 bullets. I
Hmm.
mean, so yeah, it became a little bit of a staple that's what we were doing. I mean, anytime I started to build a team for a book, it was pretty rare that like the interior artist was going to get that gig, and they sort of understood that. I mean, I always looked at it like it was another way to. I mean, sometimes it was another way to market the thing, like have another person's name attached to it. But then sometimes it's like there's very few artists that are good at both things, right? I mean, I
Right.
can probably count on one hand the artists that I think personally are really good interior artists, but also really good cover artists, I mean, like if I take somebody like a Steve Dillon, who's, for me, one of the greatest interior artists who can just make a scene of two guys in a bar talking,
Right.
like interesting. I didn't really love Steve's covers, right? When he would do covers, I mean, I just didn't, like it often felt to me like it was a panel that was just kind of blown up to a thing or like a splash page kind of thing. Whereas someone like Dave Johnson, like he's got it like graphically, thematically, he's telling a story in a single image. But, Dave would be the first to admit that getting him to do interiors is tough, and it's
Hmm.
probably not his, he doesn't, it takes too long and he's not happy with the results. And, I mean, every month for 100 issues practically. I mean, I worked on 80 issues plus all the trades with him. It was like, every month I'd get the phone call, like, a week after the cover was due. I don't know what I'm doing. This sucks. This cover's terrible. I need another day and I'll send you something. And I'd be like, all right, whatever you think.
Yeah.
God knows what those covers look like. Because then you'd get the thing and you'd get the call the next day, like, all right, I think I got this figured out. Here's what I want to do. And I mean, first he used to fax it. We were still working on faxes, but,
Yeah.
then emailing it or eventually I think he was probably texting it or something. But like, it would be this amazing thing. You'd be like, Jesus, what did the one look like that you threw out? But like, it just like that was his process. So, but yeah, I mean, it definitely was a thing that sort of, we went into almost every book, like thinking like, all right, who's going to do the cover for this? And it was pretty rare. I'm trying to think of projects I worked on where the interior artist ended up doing the cover, but I can't really think. I mean, sometimes too, it's just marketing, like something like getting Jock on Scalp, right? Like those other guys, like nobody knew them really from a hole in the wall. Like, I mean, Jason had done the other side, but that didn't really sell all that well. I mean, it was really well received
Hmm.
critically and stuff, and it was a great book, but like it didn't really blow the doors off, like on a sales standpoint, some book about Vietnam, but from an artist that nobody had ever heard of, so then yeah, even doing Scalp, like that's still a big flyer for the company. So it's like, all right, well, Jock is really hot coming off Losers, and everybody loves him personally, and he's doing, so it's like let's get him on it. At least it's something that retailers can see or fans can see, or people are going to stop and pay attention to it.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many extra sales that's worth ultimately, but it's got to be more than it's not, right? I mean, it's got to, so and that was sort of always the philosophy.
I mean, I have to admit, like I've picked up Vertigo books just because of the covers before. Like I'll pick up a number one just because of it, and like that's the idea. I mean, like ideally everybody's pre-ordering every comic, but at the same time, like if you're walking around the stands and you see this piece of art that really stands out to you, like a lot of the
Mhm.
covers that Vertigo did, it does a really amazing job. I don't know why, but I feel did Pia Guerra do one or two Why the Last Man, or was it all Massimo?
Well, originally it was J.G. Jones who
Oh, it
did like
was JJ.
first 14 or 15, and I came on right around that time, and then we got along really well, like he and I, but like I don't, he just wasn't happy about it. Like I think it was a real struggle, so he left. He was doing that Wonder Woman Batman thing, I think at that point. He had some, so he left, and then we had a couple. Maybe Pia had done maybe one or two in there where we needed an artist.
Mm-hmm.
I had a few, and then. I was just talking to somebody about this recently, but I had gone to a show in Italy like in 2003, and there was this like little ash can of a comic called like John Doe, which is some weird comic book, and he had done the cover, and like I went around this whole show like in broken Italian trying to like find this artist, and like nobody really could point me in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of a cool idea actually for pitching a new series. People should probably use it, but like they had all the interior artists that were going to work on it because they're kind of a rotating stable where they had all done the same 2 or 3 pages like of the script, but so you could see all the different styles of the various artists that were going to like maybe work on the first year of the series or something. So, and Ricardo Berchielli, who ended up being the artist in DMZ, like he had 2 sample pages in that book. And so I immediately was like, I don't know who this guy is, but he's a genius also.
Yeah.
So I finally, by the end of the weekend, had tracked down the dude who was like the writer sort of slash publisher of it. And, and that's always tricky because I'm sort of like, I really love the people you're working with. Like, I want to steal them away from you. But he was like totally gracious and like, oh, because I always feel like, particularly, I mean, I had a lot of luck working with Europeans and in particular, but South Americans, other people, and there's definitely a quality of like, you know, it's a little like, if this guy can make it, like if I can help this person make it, then maybe that's going to help me make it,
Yeah.
or whatever. I rarely ran into any resistance in terms of people saying like, oh, I don't, like it was a competition. I always felt like it was like, like they gave a leg up, and then you'd go to the show next year and that person would take you around and show you, hey, here's 3 more people that like are great. And, and that, yeah. And so all those people I had like year after year after year in those different places, almost all of them, were like strung together, like person to person to person, so, but, yeah, I don't know. She might've done, I feel like she definitely did one. I don't remember actually now, but, yeah, that was generally the case, but that was by design though.
I do
For
think
sure.
your point about the like kind of separation between cover art, people who excel at cover art versus interior art. Like I think Steve's a great example, just because his strength was always storytelling. Like he's
Yeah.
just such a good like character actor and so good at like making stories work. And it's like it's a different situation than on covers. But I do think that you worked with 2 people who were particularly great at both. I mean, John Paul Leon
Hmm.
and Jock are both excellent at
Yeah.
both. And so
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
I could talk about this stuff all day, but let's move on to where we live. It's the anthology project you're helping J.H. Williams III, Wendy Wright Williams, Eric Stevenson, Dave Stewart, and a slew of others put together to benefit the victims of the Las Vegas shooting from October of 2017. Obviously, a big and important project, which means it needs someone experienced to help bring it to life. Why is that you? What is your role on that job?
I mean, it's by far the biggest thing I've ever, tried to take on or had to deal with. I mean, I'd done anthologies before at Vertigo. Like we'd done some anthologies and things here and there. We try to do them, but they're always a lot of work because it's like, if you've got 4 6-page stories in a regular comic, then there's in an anthology, say, then each one's got 3 or 4 people, writer, artist, colorist, letterer, I mean, you could be working with, 16, 20 different people just to get like one 25-page comic out or 20-page comic out. But
And this is
yeah,
300 pages?
yeah, I think it ended up being like 300 and something pages, 330 or something like that. I mean, it wasn't, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things where it's difficult to sort of turn people down who want to like volunteer to be in it, so, and everybody seemed to have something to say, and a lot of it's very different in terms of what people have to say about it. But yeah, I wasn't prepared for how much work it was. I mean, it really was just like unbelievable. Like, I mean, just all day long, like so many moving parts, So, I mean, thankfully I had some help. Like, I had like said okay to do it. Like Eric Stevenson had called me out of the blue, like in November, and was like, "Hey, we need help on this book." And I don't, I should probably pay more attention to. I pay a lot of attention to the news, probably more than I should, but I should pay more attention probably to comic book news because like I hadn't heard anything about it. I didn't really, I don't. I'm not reading like necessarily all of the comic sites
Sure.
every day, So I probably should, I guess. But so I hadn't really heard about it. I don't, which is, I mean, it's a tricky part of being a comic book editor, or working in comics in general. Like your fandom element is kind of disappears, right? Like it's hard to make yourself, pay attention to what's going on, other than from a professional standpoint.
I think that's kind
Um,
of like that for almost every role, though. I mean, it's like my dad
yeah,
always told me, like, be careful about making what you love your job.
yeah,
Just because it's like, when I write about comics, I have to admit I read less comics than I used to, and at least in part because like I'm so immersed in it that it's just like,
yeah.
I don't know, it's like you're drinking from a fire hose all the time. You almost kind of have to dial it back the rest of the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I always felt like just in general, people who's, and I always try to give that advice. It's like, if your only frame of reference is comics, like I'm not that interested in you probably, like from a creative standpoint, maybe as a
Absolutely. Yeah.
personality, whatever. But like if you're a writer who's only ever read comics, or you're an artist who only ever draws comics, like you're talking about comics or learn to draw from comics, like it doesn't, like that's not really getting me like kind of excited enough to sort of say, I mean, it's perfectly fine, and I'm sure you can find stuff to do, but like for me personally, that was never, I think, because but I had grown up loving comics, reading comics. So yeah, that is kind of a bitter pill to swallow when you realize like, the joy of going to the comic book shop. And you find yourself there like on a Friday night, like, and you're like, maybe I could call this person, or that person does good stuff. I should check in. So it's all like kind of work and whatever. But so yeah, so the project, I mean, I'd never been prepared for anything, and they sort of called me out of the blue and said, "Hey, we need some help on this," and I was like, "Oh, sure, anthology, like okay." But yeah, and it had already sort of been like a little bit in operation for a bit, and then so they had a lot of the projects already sort of at least preliminarily approved, in terms of the ideas, but they didn't have a lot of structure in terms of like some of the stories were, if I did an anthology, like I would say 6 pages is like the max, but even for a thing like this with as many people, like I think some of the other projects like this, like I don't know if Love is Love, like maybe it was like a page or 2 pages each, like it was, I mean, there was maybe a little variety, but like generally, this was kind of a little all over the place just in terms of some were real short and some were longer. And so it was like, we got to figure out a way to, keep the page counts at least somewhat, in line. Cause I mean, it's great that people have so much to say about it, but like if you're printing an anthology that's, 300 pages, like, you can't really give 22 pages to one person and two to someone else. And
I also feel like Love is Love was a lot smaller.
yeah, no, it was. It was a lot smaller. I mean, yeah, this is like the biggest one. I mean, I don't know. It just sort of, I mean, Eric and Image, to their credit, were just sort of like, yeah, like just, if there's people that have stuff they want to do, like, I mean, I think that's their approach in general, right? Like, I mean, it's just sort of, they don't really want to be in the business of putting their foot on like a creator's neck, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, so, and not these other projects are necessarily, that's probably a bad use of, turn of phrase, but like, just that, I mean, I'm certain that a company, DC or other people that, I would work there for so many years, live there. That's a Freudian slip, but
I'm
but,
sure it felt like it sometimes.
yeah, no, and I mean, they have set, page, they have book lengths that they know that they can print, so it's got to stay under X amount of pages, or it's got to be this, it's got to be that. So, I'm sure that their parameters are somewhat a little more restrictive than mine were. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's definitely that sort of thing that was, but that didn't seem to be really an issue, what, like everything in Image is, I mean, Eric kind of, if he's supportive of the project, like he's not involving himself really in those kind of choices.
I am kind of curious. So you stepped in after Scott Alley was originally announced as the editor. Like, how much groundwork was already laid out when you came on board? Like, it sounds like some of the teams were together, some of the ideas were together, but I imagine, given how big it was, there's a lot more
hmm
to come, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely a lot. I mean, Jim, JH Jim, I call him Jim now, but Jim and Wendy like had, they'd certainly done a lot. There was like amazing people that they'd lined up, and incredible people that I could never have gotten on projects or whatever, and lots of all these eyewitnesses and locals, and that was like a huge thing for them, was the emphasis on having those people involved, like I think from day one. So there was a lot of projects. But there was definitely things that I felt like, we needed to shore up, like some of the, spreading around just some of the genres, so to speak, or, just even some of the creators, maybe bringing in, some different types of creators, or younger creators or newer creators, I mean, just everybody has like people that they know and you kind of lean on. And I'm not as good about that as I should be, right? I mean, it even goes back to saying I should pay more attention maybe to the industry. Like you said, I mean, part of like having a crew of people that you work with all the time is that you have a crew of people that you work with all the time,
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, it doesn't necessarily always keep your mind as open as it should be to like a new person or whatever. So, but this was a good opportunity to sort of do that, because there was a lot of new people that I'd never worked with just sort of coming forward and saying, hey, we really want to be a part of this in some way. So a lot of that there was definitely a lot of that in thing, but they definitely needed some help just in terms of, hey, page lengths, and we need to start lining up, the editor, or not the editors, the letters, and try to find some colorists to line up for this, and just down to things like book maps and things like that. I mean, that's not really anything Jim necessarily would ever have to worry about. I mean, he got a pretty much a crash course in like
What your
line
world is like.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's definitely a lot. It's kind of a funny from that standpoint. And then, we got some really good help, like this Michael Perlman, who I guess was just like an art collector,
Yeah.
and not to say just, but like sort of known in the industry for collecting art and stuff, which is, thankfully like a rabbit hole I never went down. But so he knows a lot of people, and he had already gotten involved. I don't even know how he got involved. Maybe he collected stuff from Jim or whatever. And he initially was just sort of like going to help run the database and sort of because we had this huge database, right? Like, I mean, his spreadsheets are just, I mean, crazy amounts of creators and stuff. And so he was going to help with that. But then basically at some point, like he just became like, I mean, essentially I'd say co-editor, but I'm assistant editor, associate editor, whatever the hell, term you want to use for it. But yeah, he just became instrumental in like, following up with people and sending out blasts to people and keeping everybody on schedule and, all that sort of stuff. And then, even, I mean, it gets to be, you've got stories, 200, 250, 300 pages of stories, but you got to find people to like letter all that, or you got to
Right.
find color all that. So, I mean, thankfully, a lot of these teams had people, or there's some creators that just did it all themselves, but, and then they had this one guy, Bernardo Bryce, I
Bryce.
guess his
Yeah.
last name.
Hmm.
And I mean, again, like I'd never heard of him, like like for whatever reason. And I get, they had his name. It just said next to his, has volunteered to letter some pages. So I reached out to him about lettering a couple that were done. I think it was like the Josh Dysart story was done kind of on the early side, and reached out to him, and he basically unprompted said to me like, you need help with this. And yeah, I was starting to really feel a little desperate, like, oh, what are we going to do? And so he's like, well, how about I volunteer to do like 100 pages? And I was like, 100 pages? Like, you got to be kidding. And like, yeah, I mean, I literally like tears in my eyes because I mean, not kidding. Because I mean, this was like a morning to night weekends.
Yeah.
I was waking up like in the middle of the night, like just every night, like just in a panic about like,
Just a
because
spreadsheet in your brain, basically.
yeah, exactly. When there's that many moving parts and you're just sort of like, you're missing something. Someone fell through the cracks. Somebody didn't get responded to, yeah. So anyway, so Bernardo was like, I'll do 100 pages. And I was like, oh, really? So, and even that seemed high. I mean, obviously it's high, but like that seemed like, oh, that'll be plenty, like that'll be like most of it. But of course it's not. It's like a third of it or something.
Hmm.
I don't know what he ended up doing. I mean, he ended up doing way more, I'm sure. And then he was checking other files, and I don't know. I've worked with a lot of great letterers, but he's definitely he's so conscientious. Like he's just like he would check stuff, and a lot of letterers, I mean, they're really good, but like they don't necessarily read it in terms of from like a content standpoint,
Right.
and sometimes that's fine because you don't necessarily need another person in the mix. But there were definitely moments where he would be like, hey, this doesn't make sense. Like the script is messed up or whatever. Because sometimes letters over the years that I've worked with that weren't so hot. Like, you'd send stuff and you'd get it back exactly the way it was written on the script,
Even if it was
and
nonsense.
yeah, and you'd call the guy and be like, what happened here? And he's like, oh, that's what the script says. And I'm like, I know that's what the script says, but, like call me or fix it or what, we know what it's supposed to say, and I get it. Like, I mean, a lot of other, particularly if you're working on the line, like in DC or Marvel, and you're just supposed to be churning out, the 50 books or something, like they get taught pretty early on, like don't grow a brain, right? I mean,
Right.
I think that's changed over the years, but the older guys particularly were like, those guys were just not doing anything that wasn't strictly by the book, so to speak, like the guys
Hmm.
who've been around for like the older eras, or think they really were just sort of like cogs in the wheel, in a lot of ways. But yeah, so they needed a lot of that sort of help, and but thankfully these other people sort of stepped up, and I mean, I felt bad for Jim because it was just like so much of his time, like taken away from his own projects, and he's got projects, I think at Image, that are coming out, and some other things, and I mean, he just like basically lost like 6 months, I mean, in that respect, just because he was on all the stuff and reading things, and so. Yeah, I mean, and it wasn't really what he'd ever done before, necessarily even what he'd signed up to do, but that's what happens, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it really is like kind of an amazing, uh, you know, comic in the sense that it's like all these people from, legends like Jim to like people like Michael Perlman. I'm gonna give a quick tell a story that he's probably gonna hate that I actually tell it. So back in the day, I used to be one of the people who ran Multiversity Comics, and we did this auction where we had artists create original art of like Guardians of the Galaxy / Rocket Raccoon to benefit Bill Mantlo. All the money went to the Mantlo family. And so one of the pieces was this amazing piece by Christian Ward, the artist, and he,
Right.
it was like the most hotly contested piece in the auction. And so Michael ended up losing it at the last second to somebody else, and he like sent me a message, and he was like, "Hey, if this person ends up backing out, I want to buy it." I'm like, "Okay." Anyways, person pays for it. We never know what exactly happens, and then like 6 months later, or no, 4 months later, it's like Christmas, and my parents bought it from me. And so Michael and my parents were bidding each other up for like this entire time,
Oh,
and my
no.
parents ended up getting it, and he was like, you got it. And that was kind of how I got to know Michael, which is funny because he set up this interview and everything. But I mean, it is like, I know Bernardo from Twitter. It's like there's all these people, from like people who are up and coming, people who collect art, people who who are involved with it because they live in Vegas or they were a victim. It's pretty impressive. But one thing I was curious about is like, this isn't a traditional comic by any means. Like, there's a wide, huge, disparate arrangement of comics in there. Some of them, I'm sure, are just like maybe not even comics. There might be I think there's pro stuff in there, right?
Yeah.
So it's like trying to balance that into something that flows and makes sense seems like it would be an incredible endeavor. Like, is that like the organization process and the structure, is that a big part of what you're doing here and making sure that it flows and feels like something that has weight and also makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in this particular case, I was probably more like a line editor, like content,
Sure.
trafficking manager in a lot of ways. Like Jim being sort of like, we'd say like the curating editor. Like it got down to the end when we got all the projects in and we had them all in. I think they had to be in like at the end of March or something. Like was like, so you've delivered like 300 pages of comic art or more in just a few months, right? Because I didn't start working on it until like I think Thanksgiving or right after Thanksgiving. So I mean, it's kind of ridiculous that much stuff could come in that amount of time. But yeah, so the big thing was like, well, how are you going to lay this out? And so Jim kept asking me like, well, what should we do? I've never done this before. And I said, it's like making a giant mixtape, right? Like you
Right.
need to, it's got to flow. You don't front load everything. You don't,
Have 20
back
pro
load
stories in a
everything.
row.
Yeah, and there was even situations like there's a bunch that are sort of real genre-y, sort of fantasy or science fiction looking, and that could be sort of weirdly jarring, right? If somebody's kind of expecting something that's more akin to, like kind of nonfiction or reportage or something, or personal, survival stories and stuff which are in there. But, so we're like, well, you can't have that in the first page because someone's sitting in a shop flipping through it, and the first thing is like a dinosaur on the first page, like, that could be a
Right.
real turn off. But you can't have like, a kid getting shot on the first page either, So it's like, you have to sort of take all that into consideration. So he eventually sort of did what essentially like the building of the mixtape, in that respect. So anything in terms of how it reads through from beginning to end is really like, down to him. And I assume Wendy, like, they helped and all that. But yeah, I mean, there were certainly things like, we have survivor stories, right? Like, I don't know, there's like 8 or 10 at least, I think. And so that was a tricky part. Like, do we put those all in one section, together,
Right.
or do we spread them out? And they're really powerful, and you have to remind yourself like this is actual stuff. Like that's the crazy thing, when you read this, you're like, this is actually the person who doesn't write and draw comics, doesn't know anything about this. They generally would talk to the writer, sort of almost like an interview, and then the writers were coming up with like the 5 or 6 or so pages of story. But you don't necessarily want them all together because I mean the other thing, you read them all and they're all individual, but they're also like they're a lot the same, right?
Right.
We're at this
They're recounting an
festival.
event.
Yeah, and we think they're firecrackers, but they're not. They're gunshots. And then we had to run and we climbed a fence and we got to, like essentially that narrative like is true for a lot of the people that were involved, but
Hmm.
like individual, aspects of it are what separate them, make them their own. But each one, but like so but you don't want to put those all together. So I don't know. We were trying. I mean, we went back and forth. I mean, I think one of my better contributions, at least on some level, was like figuring out a way that you would separate those out. So each one of those stories has its own like dedicated page when you get to it with just the person's name. And then you get the story, and then you actually have an out page that's just like sort of a blank page. So it's almost like a little palate cleanser that before or after you wow yourself with these stories. And so that was the thing. Jim liked that idea. And, Eric, to his credit, I mean, the tricky part is, so there's 10 or 12 or 15 of these stories, and you want to add 2 pages each to these stories for like a design standpoint. Like you've just added, 30 pages or more to the thing with no content essentially. Like they're just, but Eric like didn't has, he was like, yeah, whatever, just let's do it. Like he didn't, like there wasn't any. I mean, that's the beauty of like working with image in general, right? Is that, it's just like you don't get those sorts of pushbacks that, maybe that's crazy, in terms of a business standpoint, but it's just like from a creative standpoint, or particularly in this case, you're just sort of like, it's a huge relief. It's just the person is just like, yeah, if that's what you guys need, like let's just, we'll figure out a way to do it.
Well, and it's pretty reassuring, especially considering the fact this is a book that's for charity. This is a book that's going to it's the GoFundMe, right, for the Las Vegas victims.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's changed to the actual. I'd have to look it up and see. They were doing a press release, I think, actually, maybe even this week, about what the actual mechanics of who's getting the money, because Jim has like managed all that with like local charities and stuff. But yeah, I mean, essentially, it's like a local Las Vegas charity that works very closely with like the victims and the victims' families. It's not like, just some giant organization that's,
Right.
The Red Cross, or, people do good work, but, these big charities where like a lot of it goes to overhead or marketing and things like that. I mean, he was really adamant that it be a locally run, that he could really keep kind of tabs on, where it went and all that sort of stuff.
Well, he's local there, right?
Yeah, yeah. He's not from there, but he's lived there, I gather, for a while. So, but yeah, so he knows a lot of people, and there's actually more creators around there than I thought there were. Like when you start to figure out. I mean, the other thing we decided in terms of like the creators was, it's a charity thing, so you don't really want to be. Obviously, there's bigger names than others, in terms of people that are going to move the needle, whether it's Neil Gaiman or someone else, in terms of sort of from a marketing standpoint, but. For one thing, which just are like, we don't need like the bios, right? Of all, oh, I did this and I won an award for that. And, all that kind of stuff could feel kind of tacky in a book like this. So
Yeah.
we just had at the end, the contributors section, I don't know if it was my idea or someone's, but it's basically like, it's where you live is essentially like the name of the section. So it's just like, it says Will Dennis, editor, Brooklyn, or it says Cliff Chang, artist, New York, whatever it is. So it's very like kind of, it felt important to kind of keep everybody's, you read this huge list of names and there's Neil Gaiman's right next to, some letter next to some color, so it was that sort of thing. But yeah, it was just about that sense of like community and whatever, was sort of the, genesis of the whole thing.
Yeah. Speaking of Vegas, you were saying about how there are a fair amount of creators there. I'm pretty sure. I think it's Gilbert Hernandez who lives there. My friend lives in Henderson, which is right outside of Vegas, and like he was in a shop and he ran into it. He doesn't read Love and Rockets whatsoever, and he was just like, he was like, oh yeah, do you make? He was saying about how he makes comics, and he's like, oh yeah, what do you do? And he's like, Love and Rockets. He's like, never heard of it, and I'm just like, oh my god, this is hilarious.
Well, thing, there's very few, like, we've always said there's no comic book rock stars, like, I mean, there's maybe a couple, but it's never. I mean. The only time it's ever happened in real life, I was with Jim Lee. We went to a show in Philadelphia years ago, and we left the show and took a cab down to South Philly to get cheesesteaks at like Gino's or Pat's, which are like those famous cheesesteak places in South Philly. And so we made like the driver like wait. We're like, just wait. We're just going to get the sandwiches and go back to the convention center. And some kid in line recognized Jim. He wasn't in town for the show, and we're like. And we're like, what? Like, even Jim was like, I don't understand. Like, how did you recognize me? And he's like, the kid said, you're the second most famous Korean I've ever seen. And the other first one was like a baseball player or something. We were both just like, all right. But it's like, yeah, you count on one hand the times that like away from away from a comic book hall or some convention hall that people are recognized, so
I will
which
say that where we
yeah, that's
live has a lot of those. Like if they're not rock stars, they're near rock stars. I mean, the Allreds are. I mean, Allreds are kind of actual rock stars because doesn't Mike
right.
play music?
Yeah,
I mean, Jeff Darrow, Brian Michael Bendis, Neil Gaiman, like the list, Mike Mignola, Mark Miller, like the list of people who are in the book is just like kind of astonishing. So
yeah.
I mean I that was one thing I was kind of curious about is like, and I know it sounds more like it was a gym thing, but it's like I wonder, like I had wondered whether or not you try to balance out like you don't want like it all front loaded with just Neil Gaiman and then like Brian Bendis and et cetera, et cetera. You want to kind of intersperse newer creators with more established creators. Is that something you guys try to do?
Yeah, and I think I think it helped me, or I think it helped for me to come along that like, I could definitely, open up some of those things. I mean, there's definitely some, you bring in your own people that, you can count on, and then you can bring in some, other newer people or whatever, or they're recommending other people or, the other thing too is like you can tell creators that you normally work with, you don't have the constraints of having to like check necessarily a lot of marketing boxes, So in some cases, like if there's an artist or a writer that you really wanted to work with, like sure, like do 2 pages for free, like, I mean, so you've definitely got more of a little bit. You could cast a wider net in that respect because you're not necessarily. I mean, you do have the heavy hitters that are going to draw a lot of the attention for the book and hopefully raise good money for it. So then there's more room to kind of put in some newer people or
Mm-hmm.
give people a chance to sort of do something or just do something they wouldn't normally do. I mean, like I say, there's more. Like Jock is in there, but this woman Talia, who actually was a student of mine years ago at NYU. I teach a class occasionally at NYU, a comic book class, and
Mm-hmm.
she's a really great writer, but she's not she was like an accountant. She was in the business school at NYU, and she had done some comic stuff for me years ago in an anthology, but she's from Nevada, so I was like, hey, you might want to, and I know she's still doing writing stuff and she's trying to do writing stuff or whatever, but she's been, so I was like, do you have any ideas? She'd done a lot of poetry and prose writing, and so she wrote this like poem, like this really amazing poem, but we needed like an artist to do like a spot illustration. So it's like I called Jock and say, hey man, like we need some art for this page,
That's
like
amazing.
it doesn't have to be something crazy, right? And it doesn't, I don't want to take a lot of your time, but like, can you send us something? And of course he sent this like incredible, cool, Jock sort of piece to go on this page for her poem to go on, so, but then, I mean, it's like, then you get to call her up and say, hey, guess who's doing the art on your poem, like, it's just,
That's unbelievable.
yeah, so it's lots of things like strange little connections like that, and using people that might not normally, but have a connection to the location or the area or whatever. So I mean, like I said, I mean, again, you have it's. I mean, that's a good thing about being an image in a lot of ways too. It's just you do feel a lot more freedom to sort of maybe take chances that you wouldn't have always been able to take.
Mm-hmm. I do two really quick things. First off, I think fitting, given our earlier conversation, that Jeff contributed to it, Jeff Lemire,
Hmm.
because he loves he does so much. It's unbelievable. He finds time for everything.
Yeah,
But the
yeah,
other the other thing I wanted to note was like you talked about how Eric was totally fine. Eric Stevenson was totally fine with including like those blank pages in there, despite the fact that it was going to add 30 pages and cost with that. I
hmm.
mean, the thing about this is like going back to what I was saying about Michael Perlman and Jim and Bernardo Bryce and everything. It's like it's kind of amazing, like when you see a project like this come together where people are truly trying to do something for like the betterment of society. And it's like there's like kind of a schmaltzy element, like this incredible altruism behind it that like I find to be pretty astonishing because you just don't really see that type of thing very often. Like that's why I think Love is Love was such an incredible accomplishment, and this is too because you have all these people doing things for the right reasons, and I guess you don't really get to see that very often anymore.
No, or I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess we've definitely seen it in the last couple of years in this country. I think more people sort of getting out there and expressing their
Yeah.
problems or dissatisfaction or getting involved. I guess is like a better way to say it. But yeah, no, I mean that's the thing, and it is as pain in the ass as it was at times and stressful. And like I said, I mean, like waking up and freaking out about I didn't do this, that, the other thing. It's like you had to constantly remind yourself, like, yeah, but I didn't like get shot at like a at a country music concert. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like you're actually like, you know, like I just needed to shut up at that point and stop complaining and stop worrying about it because you'd get to, you'd open up some file of 5 pages of the story and be like, holy crap, like this is actually, like there's one from like essentially like a teenage girl in there, it's like a survivor story, and it's like this isn't like a fake story, like this
This
isn't
actually
fake,
happened.
this isn't a thing, like this is the rest of her life, like this is what her life. I mean, not many of us have too many like defining moments in our lives, maybe one or two at the most, and they generally are positive, getting married, having a kid, things like that. I mean, so this is like, and that's the thing. Like, I don't even know, like, how do you push past that? How do you make that not what your rest of your life is about,
Right.
And it's sort of like that's the sort of struggle that I think a lot of these people, particularly, people, we move on to the next thing, and then it's sort of, I mean, I think that's Jim's big thing, worry and whatever, and why he's so, passionate about this is like, we so quickly move on to the next one, and unfortunately, there are next ones and next ones and next ones, and it's, so there's something to sort of hopefully over time, like be able to, help people at least in a small way, or at least remind people that they weren't forgotten or that they did have something, to contribute or, yeah, and it's easy to get caught up in all this nonsense and comics and the dramas and, the sort of professional rivalries and all that kind of stuff. But it's also really nice to be able to pick up the phone and call Jock and say, hey man, I need this thing. Can you do it? And he says, sure. Like, when do you need it?
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I mean, I
Yeah.
love seeing it. I mean,
Yeah.
like you were saying, because it's like one of the things that is always kind of astonishing is like I had a really hard time remembering when this shooting happened because like there have been so many big things that have
Yeah.
happened since. And, like it was like simultaneously October felt more recently than I expected and further away than I expected, and it was really weird. And I imagine like for the people who are being featured in this that were involved with it in some capacity, like in the were at the shooting and everything, it's like there's probably like a level of catharsis for them in being able to share their story and making sure that people remember it through this type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so, and they're regular people, right? I mean, they
Yeah.
weren't people asked to be doing any of this, they're not people that, I mean, there's definitely some people, reporters and other people who, are peripherally involved with creating stuff or doing that kind of stuff or contributed, but a lot of them are just stories, like some like couple that got gifted a couple of tickets like out of the blue, like for
Mm-hmm.
fun. Someone said, "Hey, I have these 2 tickets, take them," and they went to the show. They're not, they weren't aspiring to write comics like 6 months ago,
No.
So like, yeah, I mean that's definitely. I mean, I guess that's. I don't know. I mean, hopefully it will be some sort of catharsis for people or whatever. I mean, and I mean, Jim and Wendy were definitely pretty, but even when I got on, they'd already been very, pretty adamant about what it wasn't going to be, like the kind of things it wasn't just going to be this haranguing about guns and the
Right.
NRA, the Second Amendment, and gun nuts, and like because that would, what's the point, then you're just preaching to the choir and you're not really changing minds, or and and it's hard, and there's so much noise out there, and there's so much stuff that goes on in a daily, and the things that happen now in the news, you're like, that was a week ago, like how is that, like you said, I mean, there's so much all the time, but and I'm not even on social media anymore just because I felt like I couldn't manage it anymore, like properly. So,
Right.
I can't. And God bless the rest of you who are still on there, like trying to do everything, professionally and personally, and manage all of that stuff. But, yeah, anyway, I'm off on a tangent. But they,
No.
they were basically like they didn't want, this to be. They wanted all these different aspects of these situations to sort of get covered, whether it's kind of mental health or our feelings about it or the history of
Mm-hmm.
guns in America, or America's sort of love affair with guns, or just the human dramas of it, and the human fallout of it, or whatever. So yeah, I mean, and it's all in there. I mean, I do think that it's that they had that idea from early on, which is smart because it's not, it needed to have all these different, faces put onto it, and that's hopefully, I mean, the changes, if it's going to make changes, that's where the changes are going to come from. I mean, they're clearly not going to come from the top,
Right.
they're not come from the thing. It's going to come from, it's like these kids in Parkland, it's like they
Mm-hmm.
just are like, we're fed up. Like, we've had it. Like, you had your chance and you didn't do anything, and now we're going to try to do it. And I don't know, it's hopefully things, I think things, will change. It may take longer than we think, but it's like, I look at those kids and my own kids, and it's like they just don't have the same. Their world is so totally different than mine was at the same age, and so, and they just don't. I think a lot of it, even these kids that grow up, like my wife's always concerned, oh, they watch YouTube, they watch all these things, that's what they're doing all the time. But it's like, but that's all like do-it-yourself stuff, right? I
Right.
mean, streamers and YouTubers and all these people that now have made careers, like those are people who just decide, like, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm gonna do. So it's like if you can instill that mindset in a generation of people, like yeah, that's pretty powerful, right? That it's like, I mean, maybe they're sitting around watching TV the same as I was, but I was just sitting around watching TV, right? Like, I mean, literally
Yeah.
just watching, sitcoms and staring at it and watching commercials all the way through and sitting there for 3 hours every night, with my parents watching Happy Days or something, where it's like they're watching this, but then they're making their own videos and they're streaming while they're talking. I don't know, like it's very easy to be very down on all that stuff, and but I feel like there's another level to it where they just don't have the same. The gatekeepers aren't there, and it's sort
Hmm.
of where people like they just get the ideas that like if they want to go do this stuff, like well, I can just go do it. Like I can set up my own YouTube, or I can make my own videos, or I can make my own streams, or whatever it is, which I never. That was not my mindset when I was a child, and none of my friends. I mean, or very few of them. I mean, maybe the ones who broke out from the herd, but the
Hmm.
rest were like, we're going to go do this, and we're going to go to college, and we're going to get a job, and that's what we're going to do.
I do think it is interesting how like a lot of times like I've been guilty of saying like, oh, kids don't get the same stuff that we had when we were a kid. Like I grew up on like X-Men animated series and Batman animated series, and like now they're grown up on garbage or something like that. And like all that managed to do is inspire me to buy Batman and X-Men comics while they're being
Right,
inspired to be entrepreneurs and like
right.
to like find success with their own like passions and everything like that. So there is definitely like it's so easy to poo poo on things that like newer generations are doing, but it is kind of astonishing really when you think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I mean, just that. I mean, because that's a mental state of that I can just do this myself, which I never had that feeling. And maybe that's just me. Maybe there are lots of other people. I mean, obviously there's creators in every generation who don't think that way. But, to have a whole generation possibly of kids that sort of have that feeling, well, I don't know what they're going to do, but you get the feeling like maybe they're going to really do something cool with all that, that just that philosophy about stuff, that they're not as intimidated by things and whatever. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. But again, it's like every generation, there was a caveman somewhere saying like, oh, Junior doesn't, saber-tooth tigers the way I did. I mean, I mean, I don't know.
They're using
Everybody's
spears. This is embarrassing. You're supposed to use
and
your hands.
my mother-in-law or other people are always talking about, oh, these, oh, things were so simple then. About it's like, well, maybe they were for you, but they weren't always so great for a lot of other people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And,
certainly a perpetual generational thing where people look back on it. But to close, I feel like this is kind of a fitting tie-in. We're in an era where like there's more like DIY opportunities everywhere. Not the least of which is comics. Like, if you want to make a comic and you want people to read it, you can make a web comic of it. And then if you want to make money off of it, you could do a Kickstarter or a Patreon and God knows what. Like, there's people who make hundreds of thousands of dollars off of Kickstarters. There's Image, there's Boom, there's Nobrow. There's like a million different publishers that maybe didn't exist, or maybe didn't have the same oomph like when you were first starting at Vertigo. I'm kind of curious, like with all those in mind, like I was a huge Vertigo guy. You worked there. Obviously it was huge for you, but what do you think with all those things in mind? Do you feel like Vertigo still has a place in comics, or do you feel like what it once was has kind of been recreated elsewhere?
yeah, I mean, they certainly still have a place. I mean, it's harder than it was. I mean, when I first started there, we were not the only game in town, but we were like the big game in town,
Right.
and everybody wanted a Vertigo book, and we paid really well, and it was easy. And we were saying no more than we were saying yes, so to people. So yeah, I mean, they still have a place. I mean, I think it's hard though because the more the money has come from TV and movies and stuff. I mean, a lot of people, and I don't think this is necessarily wise, but a lot of people have, that became a bigger part of the conversation like
The
10,
pursuit of
10
the
years.
media deal.
Yeah, that became much more. When I first started, it was like people wanted to do comics. They wanted to pitch you something. They liked Vertigo. They wanted a career doing that. So, but at some point that sort of shifted, right? Where it was started to be that was part of it, but it was like if they could leverage this into something else, that was also part of it, which is fine. I mean, that makes sense. You should try to do that if you can. But like that, so that was this creep of that sort of stuff starting to come in. So then, when you're entangled with Vertigo, which is then owned by DC, which is owned by Warner Brothers, Warner Brothers isn't stupid. They're not going to want to just front you all the money for a project that may or may not make any money, and then you just get the rights to do whatever you want, right? I mean, they wanted some piece of that, which always made sense to me. So, my pitch was always like, you can do comics here, and you can also maybe have some of this, but you got to give up a little. And the deals weren't terrible. I mean, there was always this perception that the deals were like, it wasn't like Chuck Berry like signing away the rights
Right.
to Johnny Be Good. I mean, I think the frustration a lot of people had was that the deals, if they were signed, they weren't getting stuff done, right? Developing stuff, but because everybody thinks that their thing is the thing that's going to do it, but like it's probably not, and anybody who tells you that they know it is full of shit. Like, I mean, The Walking Dead is not, it happened. Like, if you could just grow that in a lab, like everybody would, like you
Right.
can't, that just happens. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a good thing or the quality isn't there or whatever, but there's a certain level of like, sort of the stars aligning to make stuff like that just explode, right?
Yeah.
And I think they'd probably, I would think Robert, like, or someone, for instance, would admit that, that there's a level of like, they didn't see that coming. I don't think anybody saw that coming. I
Yeah,
mean,
if Robert, I highly doubt Robert when he was first creating the idea was like, one day this will be the biggest television show in the
yeah,
world.
no, I don't think so. And I don't think that the people who approach it that way are generally successful, right? And I mean,
Hmm.
the projects that I've gotten pitched over the years that were, well, it's I like, the comic, we haven't figured it out, but it's going to be, we've got this, that, the other thing. And so then that started happening a lot more, like as time wound down at DC, which, was one of the reasons for me personally, like I was like reluctant to move to California because I just felt like I didn't really want to go down that road. Like I didn't feel like I'd ever really bought a project that, you know, would be an okay comic, but was maybe going to really go, in some other media, or came. But we started, you'd get a lot of backdoor stuff where it's like, oh, this is a screenplay I couldn't sell, so maybe we can make it a comic, so then I can try to sell it. Like, I mean, we weren't acquiring that stuff, but like I'd start getting pitched that, like it should, San Diego, people wanted to take lunches with you because they had a failed TV pitch that maybe they could turn into a comic that then they could then sell to TV. And I was like, I'm not in the business of reverse engineering your bad idea.
Well, and
So
I do think that like while like I think Vertigo definitely has a place, especially given the fact that their model is different and it's a way that like not everyone can survive doing the image model when it's like you kind of make your money off of it actually selling versus
right,
Vertigo where it's like you're going to get money up front.
right,
And so like there's just always different answers for different people. I think more options is better. And so
yeah,
like it's all a question of everybody adapting to the new reality. And it sounds like Vertigo is making moves to or they're doing something with like a relaunch of Vertigo or something like that. And I wish them the best. They have some really smart people that are involved with it. Your boy Mark is involved, I believe.
yeah. No, he's running it, and I think he's perfectly. I think if anybody can sort of in this new environment like make it work, like he's the one who can make it work because he's smart about the stuff and he cares about the creators and he has really good instincts on the story standpoint. But he also, after working on Batman, running Batman, like he gets like the bigger ideas. Like I always wanted to just like do cool books and be over here in the corner, like with my stuff and not like I didn't want to be involved with like the big, crossovers and the campaigns and, all that kind of stuff. But he's in a really smart way. I always was like, had tons of ideas about, we could do this or how to fix that or how to, I always was just like, let's just do the really good books, get the best people, and, they either find an audience or there won't, which isn't, in today's world particularly, smart, or like that's necessarily realistic, that you'll just find an audience or whatever, whereas he has a lot of the same sensibilities, but also has like this other part of his personality that's quite good at like looking at, the sort of circus tent and figuring out ways to kind of do a big thing and get excited about it. He's that kind of endlessly passionate about stuff where I was
Mm-hmm.
just more kind of, I just want to work on the stuff I want to work on. And I don't, necessarily, like, I don't know, I wouldn't be, the best person for that job, for instance, right? Like if DC were to call me tonight and say, come and run Vertigo, like you know, I just don't think because I don't have all those instincts necessarily, or I don't think I'm
Mm-hmm.
good at it, in terms of what they need. I mean, I do think, they have a lot to offer. And I think the pitch is, I mean, Image is great, but the other thing, the flip side of Image is like you have to do everything yourself, essentially. I mean, they have some really good people there. I mean, they have a really good, but it's a small crew, right? I mean, there's like just a couple of people doing, publicity and marketing for all those books. There's a, handful of people in the production department. There's a handful of designers,
Yeah, and I think Eric over at Images would be the first to admit that it's not for everybody.
Yeah, so it's like you have to be prepared to take on all of that kind of stuff, and really can essentially send it to them kind of fully formed, And that, I mean, that to me was a huge, cold water in the face when I first started because I would call up or email and be like, "Hey, who over there does X, Y, and Z?" Because I was used to working with DC where it's like I couldn't get a cup of coffee without getting 10 people to sign off on it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And they're
so
like, "You're in charge," and you're like, "Ah."
yeah, so essentially they'd be like, "Well, yeah, that's the kind of stuff you guys usually do, and just let us know, when the pages are done." You're like, "Oh, right, okay." So I mean, that was definitely a rude awakening that first year that I was like working on Moonshine or something where there's, so it's, so I think Vertigo's pitch could be that they're somewhere in between, that they're
Right.
separate from the main machine at DC, and you've got a very strong leader, but you're going to get all the support. Like you essentially can just, if you don't mind giving up a certain percentage of the stuff to share with a company that's got a now more of a track record of like actually producing, TV shows and movies and things. Like you can just you can just work on the comics. Like
Yeah.
they'll pay for the stuff. They'll send you page rates. They'll handle a lot of the marketing. If you're at shows and I don't really know that they like pay for creators to go to shows anymore. But even so, if you're at shows and you get to go out to dinner with editors, or you get to do this, or you get on panels, and you can increase your brand and all that, you know, I mean, that's to me in a lot of ways, that's like the ideal, right? I mean, you're literally just getting paid to sort of do what you want to do. You're not having to, spend time. I mean, every image guy I know, it's like every week I get another email from some creator like, "Hey, here's the new issue. If you would talk about it on social media and, blah, blah, blah." Which is what you got to do, and it's fine. But it's just like it can be really exhausting, and it can really take away a lot of time from what you want to be doing in terms of creating. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, I think that's what you have to offer. I mean, the problem is they're up against too is it's like a retailer problem. I mean, ultimately, I think the less of their problem tends to come down to getting people interested in doing stuff for them, over the rights or other things as much as. I mean, I think retailers obviously have a number in their head that is like that's my Vertigo number or that's my Image
Right.
number, that's
Mm-hmm.
my Boom number, whatever. And that's not like even a criticism. I mean, it's like you look at the previews catalog every month and you tell me like how the hell you're going to allocate the small amount of dollars you have to those books, like I don't know. I mean, so if you have a certain number, X amount of dollars that you can spend every month on different things, I mean, I don't know. I mean, something like Moonshine's a perfect example. Like I know what the numbers were on the books that we did after 100 Bullets at Vertigo, and then I know what the numbers were on Image, and the numbers on Image were a lot higher than the Vertigo numbers. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's the project, and maybe it's werewolves or gangsters,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe it isn't. Like I feel like there's a certain percentage that gets added to the order because Image has they've
Cachet.
earned this cachet. Yeah, and they've earned it. And DC, Vertigo used to have it. We had when I first started, we definitely, like we didn't, and I don't know what, I mean, things, but this is like the cycle of, the whole thing. I mean, this is what goes on. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be in the business now a long time, so it's like I got to see Vertigo when it still was, and we had books that were, crazy sales numbers, and everybody wanted to be there, and there wasn't, it was easy, but then you get a little soft or maybe a little long in the tooth, and then then someone else comes in, and you get some new people. You got Mark there, and other people with like a lot of fire and want to do something. So I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of like faith that they can make something work there. I mean, it's certainly a brand that still has name recognition and a lot of legacy stuff. So I mean, I don't know. I think it's I don't know. I mean, I think they have. I hopefully they're optimistic about their chances, and
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I have no ill will at all. I mean, I love those guys. Like, I mean, I love Mark, and I mean, I think if anybody can do it, I think he can do it. And nobody wants to see Vertigo successful more than I do in terms of. I mean, I spent 16 years, I spent the bulk of my adult working years there, and on its worst day, it was still probably the best job I'll ever have. So it's I mean, I wish him the best for sure.
Yeah. Oh, me too. I can't wait to see what they do next. I can't wait to see what you do next, and I can't wait to read Where We Live. Thank you so much, Will. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, thanks, man. I don't usually get to do these things, so it's nice to be able to talk about all these cool projects and people I've been fortunate enough to work with over the years. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with editor Will Dennis. You can find his fingerprints on comics like Descender, Gideon Falls, Moonshine, and the upcoming anthology comic Where We Live. If you're a fan of the show, there's some big news. Off Panel now has a Patreon. If you like the show and want to support it, consider backing on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. There are fun rewards and insider information you get if you do. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including David, Jason Massey, Mike Gillis, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Dan Guarino, Dan Lee, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Henning Allers, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Abraham Reisman, Adrian Diaz, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, Darren Neely, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Michael Perlman, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Schipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Christopher Carter, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mail, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corgan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nicolo, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD. Follow it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from the album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.